Hi everybody, today we're going to have a look at exception handling in Python, and you will see that exception handling in Python is very similar to exception handling in Visual Basic and exception handling in Java and exception handling in Ruby, etc, etc, etc. Okay, so first of all let's just consider what exception handling is. So I'm just going to make a list in Python of some relatively random pieces of data. Okay, all right. And what I'm going to do is use a for loop, and I'm going to calculate the reciprocal value of each item in the list. Okay, so for example, the value is equal to the item in the list, and the reciprocal is equal to the integer equivalent of the item. 1 divided by the integer equivalent of the item, and then we're going to print a result. So the reciprocal value of R is the reciprocal value of V is R. Okay, so let's run this and see if it works. No, I crashed. Oh no. So I've got a value error here. My program, when I've tried to execute it, has thrown an exception. Okay, and the exception that my program has thrown is a value error, because apparently it's struggling to convert this into an integer. Now it's not a type error, because the built-in function int in Python can convert strings to integers. For example, if this is a string and we use the int function, so int 3 is 3, that will be the result. But it doesn't like A. Okay, doesn't know what to do with that. So this is a value error. Okay, so let's just fix that so we don't get that error anymore, and let's run it again. Oh no, we've got another problem. Division by 0 division error. So this time V is equal to 0, and it managed to do the first one, by the way. The reciprocal value of 3 is 0.33333. Then it came to this one, and so V is 0. 1 divided by 0, well, that's going to give us a 0 division error. So again, the program has thrown what's known as an exception. And I'm lucky here because I'm just using an array or a list of values. But what if this was user input? A user is allowed to enter anything into the system, for example that would crash my system. Okay, so what I need to do is some exception handling. So what I'm going to do is, in my for loop, I'm going to ask my program to try these 3 lines of code. Just try. And if there's an error, we're going to use this keyword except. Okay, so let's run this and see what happens. So this time, when we run the program, we visit the first item in the list. Python can't handle that. So it jumps to the exception and it prints error. Notice that the program didn't crash. We went back into the for loop, we visited the next item in the list, we tried to do this, but we caught the exception this time because we're using this except keyword. So it prints error again, and then we go up and we visit the last item in the list, and the reciprocal value of 4 is 0.25. Alright? So that's how exception handling works in Python. Now, what we can do to be really specific is this. I could say, except this kind of error in Python, we can actually print out a more specific error message. Cannot divide by 0. And do you remember that was that exception? This exception here was a value error. So we could also add that to our exception list. That's fine. You can have as many exceptions in there as you want. Sorry, it's just except. It was value error. And we could print cannot, what was a value error? Not a valid value. Okay. So let's run that. So it looks at the A and it says no, not a valid value. Then it tries to do this one, and the exception is a 0 division error. So it says, okay, we cannot divide by 0. And 4, of course, is fine. So it doesn't run any of the exceptions because the try code didn't bring any errors. It didn't throw an exception, so we don't need to call the exception handlers. Okay, it just gives us the correct result. Alright, so there are other exceptions. For example, the indexes of this list are 0, 1, 2, and 3, 0, 1, and 2. What if we were to do I in range 10? Let's run that and see what happens. We should get an out of bounds, an index error. So that's the exception. So let's just add that to our list just to see if we can catch that exception. Index error, and print invalid list index. And let's run it again. Hopefully we've just caught that exception. Brilliant. So my program didn't crash. It managed to handle the exception. Okay. So the first value is not valid. The second value is 0. The third value is fine. And now the loop control variable I is not a valid value. So that's an invalid list index. But my program didn't crash. I'm handling exceptions. Okay. And the last thing I want to mention about exception handling is there's another keyword called finally. So when we try something, if there are no errors, we don't need to use the exception handling. We may want to run some code at the end of that anyway. So I'm just going to say print, let's just print continue. Okay, so this is, the try has happened. We didn't throw any exceptions, so we jump to the finally. Okay, and there may be something else we need to know about that. Let's run it and see. Not a valid value, continue. Cannot divide by 0, continue. The reciprocal value of 4 is 0.25, continue. So finally, the code associated with the finally keyword will always run. If there's an error or there's not an error, the finally code will always run. And that's an introduction to exception handling in Python.